Hey there folks, and welcome to this video, and apologies if you hear the fan running, it's very stuffy in here. It ended up being over 20 degrees for the first time this year in the UK this week, and I've just come out of having done a full-length Grand Prix around Sebring. But let's get into the update for my best drivers in 2025 so far, now that we're a third of the way into the year. And to start off with, I'll explain how the system works. Essentially, for every race that I watch, I will give a grading for each driver. And that will mean, basically, out of 10, how do I feel their race went? Now, it varies from competition to competition, obviously. Where we have F1, where there are sprint weekends and non-sprint weekends, the sprint weekends will have two scores, one for the sprint element, one for the Grand Prix element. For events like, for instance, the BTCC, where there are 3 races, each of the 3 races will get their own scores. It's potentially harsher on the rally drivers because each stage doesn't get its own score, each leg doesn't get its own score, the whole event does. But, at the same time, these scores are relative to the equipment. So, let's take, for example, F1. If you're someone like... Let's pick someone off the top of the head, like Oscar Piastri, who we may be talking about in a bit. If he wins a race... Okay, that's good, but the McLaren's the fastest car. But if he goes on to lead every lap of the race, that's a different story altogether. So it's not just a simple thing of going in, seeing the position, and coming out of it with this conclusion. If you made a silly mistake that cost you a place, if you got yourself a penalty that you didn't need to, that affects your score. If you then manage to, like Max Verstappen in Saudi Arabia, use that penalty to help maximise your position at the end of the race, we'll see. You don't necessarily get marked down for getting a penalty, but if you got a penalty in a way that has a drastic impact on your race and was entirely of your own doing, much like if you broke down the race, you wouldn't necessarily be marked down, but if you crashed out, you would. Yeah, it's all relative. So, let's get into the headline stats, shall we? Because before I start talking about the absolute best, I have a series of different statistics that come through. And what we've got so far is that I have put in scores for over 1,000 drivers, 1,029. On average, these drivers have started about 2.77 races, about 2.8. There have been 129 drivers who have started 3 races. The maximum amount of registered starts I have is 12. The likes of, I think it's Will Brown and Chaz Mostert, because they did the Race of Champions in addition to doing V8 Supercars. But it will change over the course of the year because NASCAR has 30-odd races, BTCC has 30-odd races as well, and some people go into different series in addition to that. Elsewhere, the average points per score is actually a 4.07. If I wanted to give it the full number, it's saying 4.072631.579. Which means that, on average, people tend to be performing roughly around where you'd expect. But I guess there's a lot of higher achievers or previous higher achievers who aren't doing so well this year, which is why it's not in the middle, it's not a 5. I've given out 11,607 points across 2,850 different scores, which is the 1,029 times the 2.77. What's interesting though is the average score per event, rather than per driver, is a 5.31. So across 75 events, the average score is 5.31, which means that for the drivers, a few of them have had some really awful races, and then some that have been alright. But in the events, it tends to be that driving is all right itself. The lowest event average is just under a 4.6, as St. Petersburg at IndyCar, and the highest is still Safari Rally Kenya. In terms of series, IMS is the best at a 5.91, just because, well, it tends to be that people do quite well when the first 3 rounds are a 24-hour or a 12-hour and then a race around Long Beach. The ERC comes in at the worst, but it's just because there are so many good performers who, or so many people who should have been good performers who just didn't deliver. Whilst Formula E sits in the middle, and the Australian Grand Prix is the event that sits in the middle. But now I'll talk about individual drivers, because I think that's what most of you who are watching this will be here for. It's hard to say who is the absolute best driver at the moment, because, well, my top 8 are all people who I've already watched one race for this season. Some of them have done absolutely otherworldly drives within their classes, like Sergio Perez Jr. and Rally Sierra Morena, who won the ERC4 and absolutely dominated in that class. Well done for that youngster. Likewise, Dean McDonald, who was in, was he in the gold entry? Or a silver entry McLaren at the 6 Hours of Paul Ricard, and ended up contending for the overall lead. Car ended up breaking down in the end, but that wasn't in his stint. So he performed really well relative to the class and the rating for him as well. Likewise, you see the same thing for Kalle Karlberg, Dennis Marshall, James Kellett. But I think the highest in terms of people who have done more than one standalone event are the likes of Seb Ogier and Johan Roussel. Ironically, both of them did well in the one where the other one did slightly less well. So Ogier's better one was Monte Carlo, Roussel's one was Rally Ila Canaria. Those are the 2 events that I've watched either of them have been in this year. Just happens to 2 that both of them have been in. The BTCC competitors are up at the top. Ash Sutton is actually above Ogier on an 8.67, where Ogier and Roussel are both on an 8.5. Those 2 wins were magnificent, to be honest. And Tom Ingram is slightly below at an 8.33. But, like I said, they've done 1 race meet. They've done 3 races, but 1 race meet. Which means, I would say, the best performer so far this year in the world of motorsport is Oscar Piastri. Yeah, I would. His performance in Bahrain was fantastic, and ironically, his worst performance was at home, but it's almost quite fitting because Australian F1 drivers seem to have always had a curse when it comes to their home event. But yeah, I would say Piastri is, empirically in this case, been right up at the top. He has performed really well and outperformed others' expectations to go into leading the championship coming into the Miami Grand Prix weekend. Others who are right up at the top here, there are a few drivers who are on an 8.0 who've done more than one event. Elfyn Evans, for example, his Kenya performance was magnificent, but he struggled a bit in Monte Carlo. Oliver Rowland, who was brilliant in Jeddah and struggled in Miami and obviously got the post-race penalty. I'm not necessarily attributing that to him. That's more of a Rottenluck thing. The same for the other drivers who got that penalty in Miami. And then we have a couple of others who are from all over the show, really. Maya Verg, who I've only seen compete in F1 Academy, but her Jeddah performances, especially in race 2 with that win, were really strong. Felipe Nasr, who, alongside Nick Tandy, who's, I should have probably mentioned because he's actually, yeah, he's still above Piastri, technically. Yeah, Nasr and Tandy have been great this season. Now I'd argue that Tandy's not had the same kind of high as he did at Daytona. I'd say that him and Nasr have been on the same after Daytona. And I think that shows in their score. Likewise, Matthew Vaxivier, who was great at the ELMS and helped with a win in the end. He was good in Daytona, but he wasn't necessarily the strongest of the drivers in the Rolex 24. Carlos Wurz has a similar thing. Great at Paul Ricard. Good, but not a leading driver right up at the headlines in Bathurst. And then somebody else who comes in is consistently good. Arthur Pellemorge, who's done really well in his 2 WRC starts in Monte Carlo and Isla Canaria. Now, I did say that there has been some changes here and there and some people who've moved around. So let's talk a little bit about them, because there have been some who trended up and some who have trended a little bit further down, especially since my previous update. One of those who I believe has trended down a little bit is going to be Lewis Hamilton. I mean, he did great in Shanghai, but when it came to Suzuka, it wasn't particularly great, and Bahrain wasn't either, and Saudi, he wasn't on the same level as Leclerc, plain and simple. Likewise, Lando Norris has struggled because, well, Saudi Arabia happened, and he's being outshone by his less experienced teammate. Like I said, I would have put Piastri right up at the top. I think Verstappen has started to pale off in the middle part, though. Like I said, I scored him pretty well for Saudi Arabia. Bahrain was his worst one, in my opinion, but in terms of performance this year. But Saudi Arabia, I think that he maximised the opportunity when it came to getting that penalty, oddly enough. But then there's a bunch of people who are tied around the 50th place mark, and Verstappen is there with the likes of Dorian Palm, Yumi Iwasa, Giovinazzi, just ahead of the likes of people such as Alex Palou, Tadasuke Makino, or Ayaan Goiven. From there, let's talk about some of the other interesting drivers of note. For example, the most average driver in that their average points are closest to the average score is Brad Keselowski. He's 825th in the standings. But it's a joint. It's not a joint 825th, but it's there's lots of people like joined 483rd or joined 526th because they've only done one event. It was a 5.0. But in comparison, you can look at the. If I scroll a little bit further down, and I find Brad Keselowski, you'll see a couple of other names who are around where he is in the standings. And they've been people who have been hovering around the average score, depending on, well, weekend to weekend and race to race. When I put a race in, it'll go, oh, somebody else has gone up to it. But I can tell you the names who have come up the most as the most average driver. In addition to Brad Keselowski, Cole Custer's been up there a couple of times. I think they technically average out in terms of the same score. Just because Cole Custer, Haas factory team, has had its own struggles, whereas Brad Keselowski, he's a champion. So whilst he may be performing better than Custer, relative level and experience and the strength of the organisations factors in here. Cooper Murray has had a similar thing with form, as has Aaron Cameron in the Supercar Series. But the standout one that lots of people will recognise is Lance Stroll. Because Lance Stroll, he had a good Australian Grand Prix. Japanese Grand Prix was his lowest score. And there are very few around him in terms of these averages who have had that sort of gulf in terms of high to low and score. But it's just, yeah, he's been the person who's averaged out at the most average before. in comparison, I do have a little formula that tells me about the most and least consistent. The most consistent, unsurprisingly, is Felipe Nasr. I've put him at an 8.0 at each of the 3 events he's raced so far this year. I think that the Le Mans 24 might go on to have an impact. Likewise for Nick Tandy. But they have done really well in their PPM machine to start off this season. In comparison, Matteo Chatillon, who is the Renault livery that you see in EA Sports WRC, has ended up as the least consistent. He had one really good performance and one where he ended up slightly below average in WRC3 this year. And there are some people who have similarly got that score that he does. Carlo Roppera is one of them. Adrian Formeau is another in the world of WRC. Kimi Antonelli is currently there, though that could possibly change this weekend. But if I have a look through, yeah, Chatillon, Monte Carlo was slightly below where I expected him to be. Ila Canaria was fantastic performance for him. Someone else who's had something kind of similar, in fact, in terms of scores, it is almost identical, is the likes of Tristan Charpentier with Sierra Morena as his strongest performance and Rally Sweden as his slightly less strong one. Or the likes of Ryan Hardwick, who I thought did really well in 6 Hours of Imola with his lineup, but struggled a bit in the Qatar 1812. But overall, this has been a lot of fun to have a look at, and let me tell you about the series that I'm covering, because some of them I will start to score this month. So, the series that I cover, the WRC, the W2RC, that's Dakar and alike, Formula E, Formula 1, World Rallycross. I also chucked in the Racer Champions, the BTCC, the World Endurance Championship, IMSA, NASCAR, IndyCar, IGTC, the Intercontinental GT Challenge, where, well, the month of May is going to be particularly intense, but June certainly is. Supercar Series, the British Rally Championship, Super Formula, Super GT, the European Rally Championship, Formula 2, Formula 3, the F1 Academy, GT World Challenge Europe, the TCR World Tour, which I am going to start watching this weekend because it comes in Mexico, European Le Mans Series, and DTM. Now, that's not a fully exhaustive list. There are others I'm thinking of picking up, like Stock Car Pro Series or Stock Car Brazil. And potentially some other smaller regional championships I might pick up watching as well. I might also think about scoring the 24-hour series, the Creventic series, and putting that in there. But that's going to be a lot of viewing time, and I don't know if I will have space in my lengthy watch program, which is not just motorsports, unsurprisingly. Or perhaps surprisingly, if you see how much content I make and the variety of things I watch. But if there is something where you're like, oh, you really should have a look at this, do let me know. The ones I'm considering including, I am most likely going to have a look at the Stock Car Series just because they're moving across to SUVs this year. And, yeah, 24-hour series I'm thinking, but outside of that, Le Mans Cup, potentially, because I do watch ELMS. The other GT World Challenge Series, America, Asia, for instance. Maybe some national series like British GT or FFSA GT. Yeah, do let me know, because I'm having a lot of fun doing this. I didn't expect to be scoring over 1,000 drivers and watching what will average out on this current trajectory at over a race a day for 2025. But it has been a lot of fun, and it allows me to explore what motorsport is in so many aspects in so many different spaces. So, thanks for watching and joining, and thanks for listening to my thoughts on this. How long have I been going for? It must be, nearly 20 minutes. I don't know when this is out. It's probably going to be out, well, ordinary restarts not long after I finish recording. So it's probably going to be out after this race weekend. But if you do have any thoughts, do let me know. Till then, bye for now.